Well, thank you for coming, and it's fantastic to be here to have an opportunity to talk about this, because I've been working with leaders for the whole of my adult life, and in the last wee while there's been more conversations about the times we live in and the complexity we're facing and how jolly hard it all is. So the question that I think we need to start off with, is it really getting more complex for leaders? My dad fought in the Second World War. He came out of the Second World War and came into a society that was completely turned on its head. And arguably, it was more complex then. So is it or isn't it? That's, I think we need to, before we go into the, hello Kate, before we go into the whole business of this complexity and the whole thing about VUCA and how it all is, we might pause and just ask that question, because we can start to generate a whole story. And I had this conversation about a month ago with with the director of tax for one of the leading organisations that we work with, and he was describing. He's not called Gabriel, by the way, but it'll do. He was describing his world, and he said, "This is what I used to have to do. I used to have to tax optimize. I used to have to keep as little money going out of the organisation as possible. I needed to keep me and all the other senior folk here out of prison, and I needed to pay as little as possible. And my job was really clear, because that's what I had to do. And it required some deep expertise of me, but I had one thing to do, and that was my job." And he said, now, this is my world. I've still got to optimize tax, but I now work for an organisation that needs to be visible and accountable, and is seen to be a responsible international citizen. And the interesting thing was, he said, we don't have to play at being a responsible international citizen. We have to be a responsible international citizen. And he said, we're being watched. Because we've said we will be a responsible international citizen, we're now being watched in a way that we weren't watched a few years ago by all sorts of people. And he said, my job now is to meet with governments and increasingly NGOs in order to talk about how we manage our tax affairs internationally. He was on his way to a meeting with a group of social activists that he said he would never ever have had that meeting a few years previously. And he said, in order to make all of that work, he's a guardian of genuinely high standards of integrity within his organisation. And then finally, he said, I can't take my eyes off social media for a minute, because things start running and I've got to be in there with whatever's going on. So that's now my current world, and that's my old world. Now, I don't think he's unusual in terms of the way that leaders describe things. I see this in our clients. I see this kind of way of things moving not only more quickly, but in more dimensions. I see that being talked about all the time. And I think it genuinely is more complex. I think what's being demanded of this leader is a shift from what was being demanded of him previously. One of the people whose work we really admire and has been very focal in terms of understanding this question of increased complexity is David Snowden. And if you haven't read this article, A Leader's Framework for Decision Making, which is an HBR article of 2007, so well dated, but absolutely relevant, he talks about the need for leaders to differentiate the issues that they're facing right now and what they're heading into. And he says one of the common mistakes that we make as leaders is to misdiagnose the nature of the things we are dealing with. And that misdiagnosing has a real consequence for our behaviour and how we head into the situations that we're facing. And this model, I think, is one of the most useful models that's around. And he says, basically, as leaders, we face a lot of problems which originally he described as simple, and he describes as obvious. These are the stuff that you know how to deal with. It's the stuff that you only have to engage a small proportion of your brain in order to sort out. So you deal with dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of obvious problems every day. So getting to here this morning, for those of you who don't work here, was a problem because you had to decide which route you're going to take and what's likely to be going on in the transport network. But you know how to do that, and you didn't really have to think very hard about it, and you got here. So those are obvious, and we have a gazillion of those every day. The real issue comes in the difference between complicated and complex. Complicated problems have multi-dimensions to them. It's in the description, they're much harder than obvious problems, but we basically know how to deal with them. They're problems that we recognize. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the medical world, where Hartil has a little bit of work, and talk about a complicated problem, which is a liver transplant. So it ain't easy to do a liver transplant. Some go wrong. Some don't work. However, everybody involved in the process of doing a liver transplant agrees what a positive outcome is. A positive outcome is patient survival, longevity of life, no side effects. So to do that, we need absolutely detailed precision. We need unbelievably high level of expertise, and we need coordination across disciplines. All of that is part of the process of a successful liver transplant. However, in order to do that, the technology is known and the process is repeated time and time again. So it's really difficult, but we know how to do it. Now, we have a whole load of those kind of issues, and I'm sure your industry is full of things that are really hard to achieve, but we've got a really good sense of how to achieve them. That contrasts with Snowden's description, which is complex problems. And complex problems have a very different nature to them. Complex problems have a quality of us not quite knowing how to deal with it. So if we think about the pressure on hospital beds that we see every year here in the UK, not the only country to have that, we've never seen a problem quite like it before, because we've never been at this point of technology before. We've never had this level of patient expectation before, and we've never had an NHS that works in quite this way before. So it's got kind of qualities of uniqueness to it. And ideas about causes vary. So if you talk to some hospital managers, they might talk about the conflict of interest that many consultants have between their private and their NHS responsibilities. If you talk to those consultants, you might hear about how inefficient the hospital managers are. And if you talk to the nurses, you might hear about under-resourcing. So everybody has a different story about this problem, which of course is what makes it complex. There are multiple interdependent stakeholders, and they're not dependent on each other. They are dependent on each other, but they don't have a close relationship. So, for example, the issue of patients moving out of hospital when they're well into care homes, social services responsibility. Social services separate from the health service in many contexts. So many attempts to improve this, many initiatives to make it better, will either have no impact or may make it worse. So that's the dimension of complex. So why is this significant? Well, it's significant because if you head into a problem that is complex as if it was complicated, you start doing things like saying we need more data. We need to analyze this further. We need to do what we've done before in order to make this work. And clearly, that's not quite the right way. A different kind of approach, a different kind of collaboration, and a different kind of inquiry is needed. So rather than taking a I know stance, the leader starts to have to take a curious, I wonder if stance. And that's a very different position for a leader to be taking. And so I think it's absolutely fascinating, because in a way, we're asking leaders to summon a different kind of intelligence. And that's the crucial bit that starts to play in here. We start to talk about things like wisdom. We start to talk about reflection and being able to stand back. We start to talk about collaboration. And all of those are massively significant in this. Where I think it starts to get interesting is that we are meaning-making beings. Hands up if you've ever tried to meditate. So, good proportion of us. So the meditation instructor says, just quieten your mind and don't think about anything for the next 3 minutes. And you last about 12 seconds. Whew, you're off. And then the meditation teacher says, so just return to your breathing and don't think about anything. And you last about another 12 seconds and you're off. And even when you say to yourself, right, I'm not going to think about anything, whew, you have no control over the meaning-making engine that is you. So we're at it all the time. It's fantastic. But how we make meaning, how we make sense of things, is the crucial ingredient for leaders and for the development of leaders. So this wonderful capacity gives us the opportunity to deal with some of the issues that we create, that we face. Of course, it's also, flipping the coin and looking at the other side of it, it's also the capacity that creates so many of our problems in the world, so many of our dilemmas that face us. So the whole environmental question that we're all facing at the moment comes out of deep, far back, a process of meaning making about our relationship to nature, about our productivity, about the development of human society. So meaning making has the profoundest of impacts, and it would be crazy to think about developing leaders without thinking about that core concept of meaning making and what's going on inside the machine. What's going on? Some years ago, the psychologist Piaget did some fantastic work with children. Piaget said, very, very simply, you can anticipate the development of kids. So in the process of growth into young adulthood, you can pretty much anticipate how they're going to structure their sense-making, how they're going to do meaning-making. You can pretty much anticipate what's coming. So the lovely story, those of you who have heard me talk before have heard me tell this story, but I think it's so illustrative. 2 young children standing on a very, very high building, and one of the kids is about this size and the other's about this size. And the little one says, look at the people down there, they're tiny ants. And the bigger kid says, look at the people down there, they look like tiny ants. Now, in that just few words difference, there's a world of meaning-making difference, because for the little one, it doesn't matter that they're carrying suitcases. They are tiny ants, because ants are that size. For the older one, the meaning-making has included perspective and distance. Now, something really interesting is happening here. The older kid can look at the younger kid and go, she's making meaning like that because... Whereas the younger kid can't look at the older kid and go, he's making meaning like that because the meaning making has evolved, but it's included the previous one. We understand the previous one. Now, Piaget said, when you get to young adulthood, you're there. You've reached this rational, cognitive state of development, and well done, you've arrived. Our theory, not just ours, but many people who have been working in this field, the field of adult constructivist development, say actually you've arrived, but the journey's still going. And the journey will take us further towards wisdom, towards encompassing multiple dimensions, towards seeing more in what's there, if we are enabled through our development to do that. So the interesting thing here, though, that it still continues to apply this model of inclusion and growth. So just as the little kid could see what came previously, this idea about making meaning, the reason we've got a metaphor of Russian dolls up here, is that when we're making meaning in this Russian doll, this way of seeing the world, we can also see what came in this stage and in this stage. But when we're making meaning here, we don't really understand what's going on in the meaning making of that way of working. So how does this translate, this idea about making meaning? How does it translate to leadership, and where's the relevance? So this isn't the work of Harthill, this is the work of very, very, very many great thinkers, and probably most important of all is a woman called Jane Lovinger. She was really interested in why young women offenders were, some were reincarnated and some weren't. And reincarnated, that's not what I mean, is it? No, what do I mean? No, reincarcerated. That was a completely different research project. And putting aside the social context, she wanted to know what was going on inside the heads of the girls. And what she discovered through her research using a sentence completion methodology was that it depended on the meaning making of the girls, and the more complex the meaning making of the girls, the less chance they had of being rearrested. So she then did massive amounts of work. This is the 1970s through 90s, and essentially formed this framework, which we've adapted for working with leaders in organisations. This, interestingly, is a development wheel that very much works this way. When we talk to people about their experience of themselves and their development through the course of their life, almost always people can talk about the time when they were very young, when they were very opportunistic, they didn't really give too much focus on other people. Then they moved into what's described, single labels here, not very helpful, but single label, diplomat, which is when I start to get socially oriented, really need to identify with other people. So my 13-year-old daughter, when my daughter was 13 in diplomat, she would be late to school because she needed to get her makeup on perfectly. And when I say to come on, it's much more important to be on school on time rather than have your makeup perfect. She'd go, Dad, you just don't understand. And what I didn't understand is she had to look exactly like her friends. She had to be perfectly done and just like her friends. Being on school on time was nowhere near as relevant as diplomatically fitting in with the expectations of herself and her friends. Of course, she moved out of that into expert, very important, diving into and understanding in real depth the workings of things and the attempts to perfect what it is we work with. So there's an idea that processes and methods can be perfected, that drilling down into the detail is the way to solve the problem, and that there's one right or best way. Do you notice the relationship between complicated and the expert description? So what really excites me as an expert is something that's really complicated, because then I can drill down, and drilling down is very exciting. Of course, each of these ways of making meaning has an upside, and the upside is the development that comes with this. The downside is a certain tendency towards dogmatism, a certain tendency to see the world as this or that, and this last point, my view of the world makes most sense. So developmentally, to be in one's mind and to believe that the way that I see the world is the way the world is a very significant developmental position to take with real consequences. So of corporate leaders that we've profiled, about 13% profile at Expert. The achiever leaders are massive in terms of organisations. And my colleague Philip describes the achiever action logic, and we describe these ways of making meaning as action logics, the logics behind our action. Describes this action logic as being the kind of pinnacle of our society, that we have built a society which is very much about what we might achieve, what we might structure, what we might deliver, what we might create. And so from an individual perspective, goals and targets drive me. There are many, many ways to get there. So there's a wonderful fluid flexibility that starts to come with the achiever. So the expert might say, if you want a job doing properly, do it yourself. The achiever's starting to say, I can't do everything, so the key question for me is, how do I delegate? How do I get other people on board to do the stuff that needs to be done? And so you get it's more, in a sense, traditionally leaderly from this perspective, and very much about get it done. Now, one of the next stages we'll describe is strategist. And this is where we get a little caught up with terms, because the achiever's also interested in strategy. How do you get to somewhere? Well, you plan, you implement. That's the way you do things. So let's get strategic about our planning. And it's got a kind of A to B to C-ness about it. There's a linearity, which of course gives great focus and drive. So why do we get 55% of people in organizations profiling at Achiever? And by the way, we worked with one of the larger American technology companies that had 85% of their senior leaders profiling at Achiever. The HR director said, "Is that good news or bad?" Which was a kind of, well, it's both, isn't it, actually? Because what the organization's looking for is the ability in leaders to focus, drive, cut through, move things forward. So that's fantastic. So then the question comes, developmentally, why would you be interested in developing your leaders to move beyond this fantastic way of making sense of things and driving and focus and delivering? So why on earth would you want anything to come beyond that? So the next action logic is described as individualist, which again, these single labels, it's a bit misleading. So individualists, the move that we're getting from achiever to individualist is the move which goes, not what are we doing, but why are we doing it? So it's more reflective, it's more questioning. Why am I doing it? Why are we doing it? Why is anybody doing it? What's this about? And of course, that questioning is the source of the innovation that might follow the question. So there's definitely a kind of an inspection here of how to get there. And the individualist is beginning to say, you know, what's there depends on how you see it. If I look at it from over here, it looks like that. But if I look at it from over here, it looks differently. So that sense of kind of absolute, which the earlier action logics represent, is beginning to soften somewhat. So multiple perspectives start to become a part of what happens. But it's the key characteristic here is this individual sense of curiosity. Why? Why? And how could we do it differently? So most organizations say they want people who think outside of the box, which I think is a really neat description of the individualist, think outside the box. Most organizations don't actually then encourage people who do, and that's a kind of difficult relationship. So this is really interesting because the experience of individualists, there are two kind of incredibly contradictory experiences. The first is, I've realized that all this achiever stuff is a bit kind of overblown. I'm feeling a need for a bit more space. I'm noticing that the organization pushes me into a box that I don't feel I belong in, and I'm feeling really uncomfortable. And the parallel dialogue from the organization is, Jennifer used to be brilliant, but she's so strong and forceful, and she's so kind of slow now and always questioning things and seems to have lost her mojo. So that's the kind of the negative thing that happens as people move into individualist. Often that person exits the organization. Over here, it's really curious. I realized how I used to work, and now I'm feeling a much more space and much more freedom and much more curiosity. And actually, what I'm noticing is the organization's really valuing me for the different things I bring, and it's really fun. I've never enjoyed work so much. And the organization is going, it's great. Jennifer's doing all this innovative stuff, and she's doing stuff outside of her direct lines of control. We really value this. So two different stories. A lot has to do with the nature of the organization as to which story is emerging. Final action logic I want to talk about is strategist, which is, I think, enormously significant. Less than 5% of our corporate sample of leaders profile as strategist. Just to get a handle on less than 5%, normal leadership team, let's say 10 people. So 2 leadership teams at the top of an organization might share statistically, one strategist, or none. Why is that significant? Because the strategist brings a systemic perspective that is both reflective in the way that I described the individualist, remember the Russian dolls, but also starts to inquire into the nature of the system and the nature of change in the system. And so that stepping back even further to go, this is curious because the system's behaving like this. I wonder where I can lever this system in order to bring about change which is positive. And that notion of change which is positive has a much bigger kind of holistic to it because it's starting to take in more dimensions. There's also something which I haven't put up there, which is that our experience of a good many of the strategists that we've worked with is there's a lightness of touch which kind of brings all this a bit more bubbling to the surface. So if you perhaps think of some of the leaders that have inspired you, there's both an intensity and a simultaneous lightness of touch. And there's both a drilling into the content, the task, and an ability to work lightly with people. So really, really significant. Absorbed me for quite a while now is, has there ever been a need for more advanced meaning making in our commercial world as well as our society? And I think the answer to that is yes, there's absolutely never been a time when it's needed more. And one of the reasons why I'm so delighted to be able to work in the corporate world is I feel, as many people do, that the impact of our organisations on the way society is evolving is massive, and I'm seeing a real shift in the organisations that I'm working with to starting to take a holistic responsibility for their part in the entire ecosystem rather than in a small fraction of it. And if you contrast that to where we're moving kind of politically in many parts of the world, perhaps the corporate world is the world that will help move us in a more positive direction. So what does this mean for leaders? Well, one of the things that we've learned, I think, really helpfully in Heart Hill over the last decade or so is that whilst one would passionately wish to see more strategists develop in organisational leadership positions, it takes quite a long time for this movement in action logic to occur, and the activity of trying to support the development of achievers into strategists as a goal in itself probably isn't the way to go. That's a background context, I would say. What's more important is to ask this question: what is it that strategist leaders do? What capabilities do they exercise which may be useful to leaders at the action logics that precede strategist? What can we borrow? What can we co-opt? And that's led us to talk about 6 late-stage capabilities. And for about the last decade, these have been core to the work that we've been doing to support the development of leaders. And they are these. First of all, and fundamental, is the notion of inquiry-based experimentation. If I always do what I always did, how do I look at things with fresh eyes? So first of all, the encouragement to inquire, to really think deeply about who you are, about what's going on socially, what the relationships are, what's going on in the system, and then to experiment in both very large and very small ways with that. So this is both an idea, but it's a way of breathing. It's a way of being as a leader, is to be very inquiring, curious, and then willing to experiment. Everything, the other 5 that I'm going to talk about are all best explored through the idea of inquiry-based experimentation. So it's a real foundation for how we might lead. And actually, I think we could start to shift how leaders work by simply educating, supporting them to be more skillful in their inquiry and their experimentation. That alone, I think, would start to move leadership in the right direction. However, also useful is the notion of the courageous use of power. So the conscious use of power, I think, is vital. We need to ask leaders to think about their power and how they use it. We need then to say, if you're seeing this, then some requisite courage is a significant part of how you operate. And to link the two, to talk about power to innovate, power to resist, power to collaborate, power to co-opt, is a really significant part of a late stage capability. Bringing that to consciousness. Language, tremendously important, both in its intent and in its structure. The reason the word positive is put in here is that one of the things we notice with the later stage leaders that we've worked with is this positivity, a not unrealistic sense of woo-woo-woo, everything's wonderful, but a real orientation towards a better future, an achievable better future. So that underpins the language. With that comes appreciation, generosity, but also with it comes a very, very skillful, conscious use of speech and how they engage with others. And then one which attracts a significant amount of attention, and I think it's because it talks very strongly about how it is to be a strong achiever in an achiever world, which is the need for passionate detachment. And I love the paradox of this, that to be more effective, our passion needs to be stepped back from. The things that we really care, we need to be able to hold, but hold here, not quite so tight. And therefore to be able to be more to have more perspectives on it, to be more distanced from it, and yet to be not disinterested, to be engaged in passion. And I think, in talk about inquiry and experimentation, I think there's a lifetime's work for all of us to inquire into that balance between our passion and our commitment and our overzealous engagement. Enables diversity, which is part of the D&I agenda, but it's also what we notice late stage leaders doing is being able to pull in, to engage, to enlist a whole range of different ways of working, and therefore different people. So that might be represented by ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, but it also might be represented simply by how people think. And a really good check for most leaders is have a quick look around your team and see how many people there make you feel a bit uncomfortable in the way that they think. If there's nobody who feels uncomfortable, then it's not useful. And then finally, exercises systems leadership. So always the consciousness is what's going on in the system. And that's really, really important, because in complex situations, there's always lots of appealing, simple solutions that don't work. So being able to take a systems perspective and step back and go, that looks like we could do that. However, what are the dynamics is really significant. And this is a kind of breathing, everyday kind of quality which people bring. So these should be informing the way that an organisation thinks about the development of its leaders, and should be playing a part, in development of leaders. What's the consequence of this? Well, the focus on individual leaders, make sure that the leadership programs are inquiry-based and use action inquiry methodologies. The most fundamental thing, if that's all you did with your leadership programs, that would be a really useful move. Do explore the notion of meaning making, because the consciousness of how do I make meaning is a really useful construct in itself. Develop intimacy and trust. It's really, really significant. Work outside in and inside out. So in other words, look outside and see what's going on in other organizations, but work from the inside of the individual. Create dissonance. So create a thing that has to be worked out here about how I stand in my leadership and what the context demands of me. So that uncomfortableness is really useful. And then increasingly, and Ben and I were just talking about this earlier, bring youth and seniority together across a hierarchy. There's something that's going on about young people's experience that's so important for older leaders. that the tradition of keeping those separate no longer seems to be an effective way to run leadership development. And in terms of talent processes, make sure that meaning making is explored through the coaching processes that you run, and then deliberately foster developmental conversations that people are starting to think about the way they think, because that's crucial. For organizational process, make the talent process honest and transparent. So make sure people are having conversations about not only what their next role might be, but how they're operating as leaders, where the strengths and weaknesses of that are, and how that's impacting in a systemic way. Do look at what's going on in the more exciting organizations, the perhaps younger, more fluid ones. See what can be taken from that. Connect the outliers. This is really significant. How many new joins leave within the first year? And what have you done to connect those new joins and to help them with the process of orientating towards the organization, about matching their meaning making to the organizations? Join women together, join ethnic minorities together, join troublemakers together. Find a way of keeping the conversation moving. Use mentoring and reverse mentoring, really significant. Create capabilities and frameworks that don't simply reinforce the achiever way of working. Create frameworks that open the door to increased flexibility and innovation. And then finally, don't punish the misfits. We want people to think outside the box. Hey, you're thinking outside the box. Don't do that. Okay. Thank you so much.